mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery.
After that, we did it! Yes! Thank you, those of you who just hung on with that line number one while the choir did their magic. Thank you, I love that. Welcome, welcome, welcome this rainy morning to the Oak Ridge Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Tandy Scheffler, I'm the Minister of Care and Connection, and it is so good to see all of you. And where do I look for the Zoom camera? All of you out there on Zoom land, thank you for being here. It is so good to be together, even as we are together in different ways. I invite you to open yourself up to the reality that we are learning, that we do not have to be physically together to be together. Let's make it happen. If you are new among us, or if you are back for the first time in a long time, you are especially welcome this morning, and we invite you to do two things. One is join our ORUUC group on Facebook. Just ORUUC, that's all you need. They'll ask you to join, right? Are we still doing that? We just like to know who's in the group, but anybody can be in the group. We just want to know who you are. So you'll have to, I think, say, I want to join, and then you'll get a yes back. And then you will be able to check out just what's going on in this community. Anybody in the group can post, and you'll see what's happening in the church and what's going on in some people's lives who want to make sure we know. It's a place to connect and to learn more about us. Also invite you to stay after the service. We have faith formation groups for all ages. We have groups for children, and all the information will be on the screen after the service. You can also join online, right, Christine? You can join by Zoom in those groups, so just watch for the links. And here in the building, if you're here and an adult and want to stay, we have a group called Together in Spirit that's going to meet in the Faith Formation office, but that group will also be on Zoom. And adults, there are other groups on Zoom. I think Reflections would be one to look for. But we will also have coffee after the service. So if you don't want to join a group, you just want to meet some people who are here and catch up, coffee will be served. I've been told it's the portico. That's what you call this drive-through section of our church. And just while we're on it, the covered area outside the faith formation wing is the breezeway. So coffee will be served on the portico, not the breezeway, but there may be another little thing going on in there, which would be a fire drill. So if it's not raining, the first thing we'll do before we go to any faith formation groups or have coffee is we will file out by the nearest exit, stay on the sidewalks, and walk down to our pavilion, which is the little covered area you will see. I'm pointing directly toward it. That's if it's not raining. If it's raining, you know what to do when a fire comes anyway. So we want to practice, but I will have told you. You leave by the nearest exit, and please keep your mask on and stay socially distanced. A little pandemic addition to our fire drill information. One other thing I want to call your attention to is that we have prayer requests available to you. If you would like something worked into the spoken prayer that we'll have in just a little bit, you can text it 865-224-6388, or you may email prayers@oruuc.org. And for those of you here in the sanctuary, we also have a book of life up front that you can use for writing something you would like to have spoken. Later in the service, we will collect an offering. We'll call for that from you and ask for you to be generous people. And I want you to know that your generosity supports not only the work of this congregation, but special endeavors that the church supports. We call this our Split the Plate recipient, that special endeavor, and half of today's offering will go to that. Half of the undesignated will go to that. The Split the Plate recipient for August is fresh fruit. That is a church-grown ministry that makes sure that children who go home with backpacks on Friday filled with canned goods because they live in food insecure households, that those backpacks also have pieces of fruit for the children in that family. It's an extra loving, nutritious addition that is added to those backpacks. Let's see, we also have a petition. Where's Abby Moore? Abby, are you in? Yeah, Abby. So we have a petition that will circulate after the service. This is to ask that we relocate the voting site from the Oak Ridge City Hall precinct, the voting site for the Oak Ridge City Hall precinct from the municipal building to the Scarborough Community Center. We are asking that this voting precinct be in Scarborough, and this is to ask the City Hall to make that change, to relocate. The group Oak Ridge Solutions on Racism is behind this project, right? An equity issue of importance. I'm just checking here. I've welcomed you. Yes, 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 yes. Done. Enjoy the service. Enjoy the service by greeting one another. On Zoom, this looks like turning your Zoom setting to gallery and letting us see your faces. Oh, there they are. Hi out there. Hi, you guys. And here, you can just sit where you are and wave to the people on Zoom, or you can move about the room, shake hands, namaste, say hello in the ways that are comfortable for you. Let us greet one another.
Our seventh principle reminds us that we are interconnected with all living beings. And as Unitarian Universalists, we seek to live into this idea through the creation of the beloved community. Indeed, we are a forward-thinking and dynamic faith. But in order to nurture our community and our values, we must remember that not only are we interconnected with all living beings, we are also interconnected with those who lived before us. Like the roots of the mighty tree that stand behind me, underground but active and alive, our past lays the foundation for the health, vitality, and sustainability of our future. Our roots nourish and replenish us so that we continue to grow and thrive. Our opening words come to us from the Reverend Kimberly Tomzak Carlson. And if you are like me and you like to move around a bit, some of you have pointed that out, please go ahead and do so. Feel the gravity of the earth holding you in place. Wiggle your toes as if they were roots. Roots connect you to the earth, lending you strength. Gently sway in the wind, turning your body like the trunk of a tree. Leaning this way and that, bending as the air pushes and pulls. What surrounds you may sway you, make you bend and feel unbalanced. Wiggle your toes. Know that your roots can hold you as you learn and grow. A tree is nourished by the soil and water. You are nourished by the food the earth grows and the water it provides. You are cared for and loved by many people. Breathe deeply. Still yourself. Know that your roots are strong. Wiggle your toes. Wiggle your roots.
Our opening hymn this morning is number 20, Be Thou My Vision. I invite you to rise, embody your spirit, and join us in singing.
The time in the service where everyone, as they are so moved and able, are invited to, if you're in the sanctuary, come forward and to light a candle as a sign of whatever you are carrying in your heart this morning, be it burden and sorrow or joy and celebration. You can write in what we call the Book of Life, something if you'd like it included in the spoken prayer afterwards, or you can go, there's some beautiful objects of nature over there, flowers to take back for yourself or give to your friend in the pew, or a stone if you'd like to have something to remind you or to sort of ground you as you go through this week to come. If you're on Zoom today, we invite you to share in the chat box with one another what your where your heart is, how you are this morning. And if either here or on Zoom, if you'd like to have something included in the spoken prayer, as well as those here writing in the Book of Life, you're invited to send prayer requests to prayers@oruuc.org. However you are, whoever you are, wherever you are on your journey, all that you are is welcomed here, and you may come forward as you're so moved. I invite you now to breathe in deeply and out again, closing your eyes or allowing them to settle on some still point in this room as you settle into the place and the moment that you are in your life and we are together. Spirit of love, source of all, precious God, we welcome this moment in all its complexity, this moment of becoming and discovery, this moment perhaps of some sorrow and regret, and also curiosity. And as we do, we lift up those prayers held among us in this community today. And there's one among us who says and lifts up the request that we would hold in love all who walk the hills and valleys of committed relationships, especially for those who are struggling and striving to better love one another. Let us be present to these relationships around us and the ones that we are part of, knowing that there are hills and that there are valleys, and that the journey may be enriching as long as we are honest and open and faithful to learning what more may be revealed. And there's one who, among us who lifts up prayers for friends and neighbors struggling with illness and loss, with the wish that they would be comforted and experience healings, and the request that we would be the friends that they need. Let us call to mind and heart in this moment the ones around us who are struggling with illness and with loss, praying comfort and healing on their lives and seeking within ourselves our part to play in it. What form of nurture and care could we take in these lives? And if we are the ones ourselves who are struggling with illness and loss, how could we make ourselves known to those who love us and invite in that healing and that care and that comfort. One among us asks that we be with those trying to stay safe during these times of the Delta variant, the Henri hurricane, fires and unrest, and reminds us to be thankful for rain, for those in the West are so dry. Challenging and daunting as it may be, let us be mindful of all that is whirling around in the world, not only these days, but today itself, and give thanks for unlikely blessings. One among us who acknowledges that life is precious is saddened that to hear about friends suffering due to corporate greed, which this person says makes us all suffer. Let us be aware of the ways in which suffering comes into so many lives, and let us, reminded of those we love and that which we love, be redoubled in our efforts to be beacons of justice and clarity and truth and righteousness. One among us gives thanks, saying that they are extremely blessed with family, love, and abundance. And let us pray these blessings would spread from lives aware of their own blessings out into other lives, that our blessings would nourish the lives of others. And let us be reminded of all the ways that we can give thanks this morning. One among us gives prayers or asks prayers for their two boys as they head off to school, and is grateful that their girl is back to the United States safely, and prays that her husband can join her very soon. Spirit of love, there are so many people we love whose lives are in motion, and especially this morning we remember those who are crossing borders and crossing boundaries, seeking freedom and safety. Let us be aware of those who are far from safety this morning, who yearn to cross borders and boundaries that would keep themselves and their loved ones safe. And let us join our hearts and our lives and our efforts with theirs as we dream of that day of the beloved community when all are held and known and included at the welcome table of the beloved community in which all are honored and have a place and a feast. With that dream out before us, let us rededicate ourselves this morning to what we must do and how we must be. With this desire in our hearts, all this we pray. Amen. Blessed be. Keeping in mind not only the ministry that we here do together, which touches more lives than we can imagine, but also the particular work of the Fresh Fruit for kids program, which makes sure that people are nourished not only in body but also in soul. As the ushers come forward, I invite you to be as generous as you can be. May the gifts you have given both here and also online do powerful work out in the world, transforming this world into the reign of love that we dream of. And now, in anticipation of your own continuing part in that work in this world, instead of holy high fives, maybe if you do a holy elbow bump with your neighbor to signal your commitment to continue that work. Thank you. You may be seated.
I'd like to invite the children down and anyone else who would like a seat on the floor. Come on down. Today, I'm going to tell you, this is one of my favorite stories, and it happens to be a story about what can happen when our plans are interrupted by the weather. John Murray was a very fortunate man. He had a great education. He came from a wealthy family. He had a loving son and a loving wife, and things were good for John. And he was a minister, and he believed in kind of a radical message. He believed that God loved everybody and that everybody was saved. And that was easy for John to believe because the sun shone on John Murray. Life was good. But as he went around delivering this message, not everybody bought it. In fact, very few people bought it, and they ridiculed him. And John started to become discouraged because people didn't want to listen to his message. And so he kind of started losing some of his confidence and losing kind of some of his zest for life. But he kept going. But instead of getting better, things just started getting worse for John. Uh-oh is right. We're in the uh-oh territory right now. John's wife and his son became very sick, and they died. And John lost his entire fortune, and he even ended up in jail because he couldn't pay his debts. And during this time, John was having a hard time believing that there was a love that united everyone, because he sure couldn't feel it himself. And so John Murray decided to start over. He had lived in England, and he decided to make a new life in a new world. And so he boarded a ship called the Hand in Hand, and he sailed across the Atlantic with grand plans to end up in New York. But the weather had other plans for John. It was foggy, and they couldn't see, and they couldn't land safely, and he ended up in New Jersey. And if you want to be in New York and you end up in New Jersey, you're in for a surprise. And this, I got to tell you, I feel for John Murray in a lot of ways, but this one really gets me, all the places to land on the eastern seaboard, John Murray lands flat on the land of a guy that's got a chapel right on his property. And this guy wants a minister, and not just any minister. He wants a minister to preach that God loved everyone. It was a man named Thomas Potter, and he had grand plans that someday someone was going to come and do this. And when he saw John Murray, he knew John Murray was that guy. But I got to tell you, John Murray did not want to be that guy. John Murray didn't want to be that guy at all. And this is where I really feel for John Murray, because you're trying to start a new life, and then all of a sudden this happens. At least Sisyphus knew he had to push up the rock. John Murray's trying to start completely over, and he's in the same place as when he started. So John Murray tries to politely defer. He said, you know what, I'm here for some potatoes. This is all I want. This is all I need. But Mr. Potter was insistent. And he said, you have come for a reason, and you have come to preach at my church. So John Murray was looking for an out. So what he said is, you know what, Sunday's a few days away. If the winds have not changed, if the winds have changed and I can sail back to New York, that's what I'm going to do. But if it's But if the wind stays still and I'm stuck here, I'll preach at your church. So we bought some time. And he kept looking at the sky, and he kept hoping that it would change. But it didn't change. So John Murray planned a sermon. He'd done this before. And he went to the pulpit, and something kind of amazing happened. Not only was he ready to talk about the love that united everyone, but he began to feel it. He began to feel it in his heart, and he began to see what Thomas Potter had seen in them, and he began to realize that he could help others see it as well. And throughout this process, difficult as it was, John Murray learned something about that united sense of love. That it is sometimes easy to feel it when the sun is shining on you, and that sometimes it's just a crack in the darkness of hope and redemption, but it's always there. I invite those in the center aisle to form an arch. If you are in kindergarten and 5th grade, we are going to go back to the hallway because the winds of change are rainy today. So we are going back to the faith formation hallway.
So this morning, of course, we find ourselves in the midst of a new surge of the coronavirus, with hospital beds at capacity and unvaccinated children even at greater risk than they were a year ago. News from Afghanistan has left us troubled not only about the fate of Afghans, but also about the role of our country in the world. The extreme weather long predicted from climate change is upon us, not only in the fires out west and the hottest month on record last month, but also Hurricane Henri bearing down this afternoon on New England. And it may be that this morning different ones of us are at a hinge point in our lives, trying to decide between this way and that, and wondering, how the heck did I end up in this situation again? Or maybe facing what is impossible to face. In the face of seeming chaos in life, is there any way to do more than decide how to survive from moment to moment? With such upheaval and disruption, does it make sense to try and make sense? In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul says, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate to do. A few verses later, he says, I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Sound familiar? Paul's a complicated character, to put it mildly. Some of us may have friends like him. Some of us may be ourselves kind of like him. These lines certainly resonate with me in my life, and maybe it's in the perversity of human nature that we would know exactly how we intend to act, and yet find ourselves doing other things, repeating unwanted patterns. This month we're exploring the theme of remembering and what good it is. And today I want to reflect a little on what difference it makes to the future and our ability to make different choices for a person to take time to pause and look back. Many of you will know who I mean when I say the name Carl Bretz. Carl was a longtime member here at ORUUC who died only last October as he approached his 95th birthday. He was a fabric artist, a World War II veteran, and a retired Unitarian Universalist minister. But one of the chapters in his life that I admire most, in which he told many people about, is something that he looked back on with pride. People who knew Carl in the 1990s and early 2000s will remember his deep, close marriage with his wife and life partner, Rosemary Burns. Rosemary was a strong and accomplished person in her own right. The two had met at a Unitarian Universalist summer conference in the early 1990s. Watching the two of them relate to each other and share life, you might think that they had been married forever and that they had some special talent for being in relationship with people. But as Carl would tell it, there was another layer to what people saw in his relationship with Rosemary. You see, he'd been married twice before, in marriages that had had their share of difficulties. When a relationship ends, people can find all kinds of ways to blame the other person, or to say, well, it just wasn't in the cards. But Carl had the insight somehow after the end of his second marriage to look to himself, to wonder what the part was that he had played in what happened. So with that in mind, he began several years of intensive, intentional therapy, trying to gain insight on his part in it all. Such a process requires humility and courage and honesty, but he stuck with it. He believed that his late-in-life marriage to Rosemary was one of the greatest blessings of his life. He felt so lucky that he got to be married to her. But in the same breath, he'd tell you that he had worked really hard for a few years before meeting her, so that he was ready for the kind of partnership between equals, for that great love affair that he knew. Because he'd been willing to study and reflect on his past, enough to see his own recurrent patterns and habits, he had now the capacity to make different choices, to develop new muscles, to have a different kind of marriage than the ones he had known. In his 1905 book, The Life of Reason, philosopher George Santayana famously wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And variations on this same idea can be found by different thinkers all the way back to Confucius, who said, "If you would divine the future, study the past." In fact, the idea is so commonplace, it may seem hardly worth much reflection. Whether in our relationships, like Carl, our personal habits, or even as a society, to the extent that we would effectively chart a course forward, we must take a good long while to look over our shoulder to see what got us here. We must study the past. And yet, all too often, we resist doing it and end up paying the price. As a country, this United States this week is learning a lesson about efforts in Afghanistan that other imperial powers had learned in previous generations. As individuals, we may be mired in familiar and unwanted life patterns or relationship dynamics. If we are parents, we may be amazed and horrified to hear words coming out of our mouths that we once heard our own parents say. The past repeats itself again and again in our lives and the world. If the idea that studying the past will help us face the future is such a truism that it's almost a cliche, why do we avoid it? Why don't we, more of us, do as Carl Bretz did, becoming a student of the enduring patterns of his life in order to have a foothold on making new choices that would create some new patterns? One reason, I think, is that we're inclined toward comfort, we humans, especially when it comes to the story of ourselves. We want to be the heroes of our own stories. It's not easy to admit when we were wrong, or that our story might contain some false steps and even ways that we have been complicit in harm. It's not easy to admit all of that. This summer there's been some manufactured outrage about critical race theory in schools. Critical race theory simply means incorporating how the dynamics of racial oppression and terror have influenced the formation of this country. It just means sharing facts and stories that have typically been left out of the American narrative. To include those facts and stories can be painful to those invested in a narrative of white innocence. And maybe on a personal level, any one of us can relate. We resist facing and including those painful parts of our own stories, especially the ones where we don't look so good. It's much easier for me to tell the story of how in middle school I was on the receiving end of bullying than to confess the story of how I would sometimes pass that bullying on to others. It's much easier for me to tell the story in this congregation about people who violated boundaries and hurt others than to tell the story of my own part in enabling them. It can be uncomfortable to look the past square in the eye. We resist looking to the past as well, I believe, because there's a thrill to imagine ourselves as special and superior to those who've come before. We imagine that surely we are better than the parents who raised us. And as a society, surely we're better and more advanced than those primitive people of 200 or 2,000 years ago who lacked the technological prowess that has given us automatic sprinklers and self-cleaning toilets. What on earth, we say, could we have to learn from those people? It's not only our desire to avoid uncomfortable truths and our desire to feel special and better than those who came before, or even ourselves in earlier chapters. It's also that we can tend to view events and people as unique and separate from their context. So when a person would hear about violence against unarmed black people by members of law enforcement, they may be oriented toward the individual character of the abusive officer and call that person a bad apple. Or when another person would see a hurricane bearing down on New England as it is today, we tend to think of it as a freak occurrence, to see individuals and events, but to see patterns over time is much harder. And we can resist seeing patterns because it's easy to dismiss a bad apple or some freak occurrence as only bad luck. When we confront patterns of suffering and oppression in ourselves or in society, when we see the intractable progress of climate change or of the Delta variant throughout the population, it can seem like we're staring down a 40-foot wave. We feel helpless to square up against something so vast. We can feel so small. And to see the present in light of the past can certainly risk a sense of fatalism, as if there's nothing to do. We may end up sounding like that weary preacher in the book of Ecclesiastes who says, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. To see the patterns of the past repeating themselves in our current day, in our own lives, or families, or society, can seem to echo the weary despair in those lines. There's nothing new under the sun. Why bother? And yet, in that seemingly dreary thought, I can also find hope. If it's true that patterns of suffering repeat themselves, so too do patterns of resistance and resilience and resourcefulness. If it's true that patterns of oppression repeat themselves, so too do patterns of liberation. If it's true that patterns of convenient deception repeat themselves in our lives, so too do patterns of courageous honesty and responsibility. Underneath his own struggles to do the right thing, the Apostle Paul wrote of a deeper law and abiding constancy in the universe from which he could draw and upon which he could depend. Our Universalist forebears, like John Murray, who we heard about in the story today, proposed much the same. They believed that running throughout history, like a river, was a powerful and redeeming force, an all-conquering creative love against which no measure of suffering could forever endure. Universalists were those who would tell you, even when things were at their worst, when life was on the ropes, that in the end, love will win. That in fact, love has already won. In the face of the ebb and flow of historic events, they saw a larger pattern in which nothing was ever finally wasted or discarded, but everything was used by that infinite and eternal source of creative love. Even now at this moment, when climate change, the Delta variant, geopolitical turmoil, and perhaps even our own households and lives seem mired in intractable complexity and impossibility, we are, as always, invited to pan out from this morning, from this month, and even this year. We're invited to take that mountaintop view where we can look around and survey for miles and miles and even centuries and to see life as it is, as a symphony of both trials and redemption, of heartbreaking failure and dizzying hope. And as we are so bold to look at life as it is, and to look at our own lives as they are, not as we would wish them to be, we can begin to sort through it, to see our part in it all, to see how we're related to others and how we could relate to them going forward, given all that we have been, all that we are, and all that we may yet be. In other words, as individuals, as a congregation, and as a society, we could undertake a project, something like what Carl Bretz did 30-some years ago, of rigorous honesty and courage and responsibility, the effort to see things as they are. As we look with that clarity and find what patterns emerge, we can then be more mindful as we turn toward the future, trusting in the ever-buoying power of love and redemption which will hold us up if we let it, and begin to take more responsibility for our lives, to be the ones who stop blaming others, who stop pointing fingers, but who instead humbly say to whatever might lie ahead, call me, send me, not as some superhero, but just as the mess that I am. I am here, I am whole, I am brave, I am willing. Let this be our pathway, let this be our practice. To the extent that we do, out of the past, we will claim a new future.
Our call to action this week. I invite you to find a time, either daily, if possible, at least once this week, where you go up on that mountaintop, take that long view, come up with one gift from your past, a person, an event, a realization that you've had. Find that anchor gift from the past. And then say to today and the next day, and the next day and the next week. What was it? I'm here. I wrote it down. I'm here. I'm whole. I'm brave. I'm willing. Repeat that after me. I'm here.
I'm here.
I'm whole.
I'm whole.
I'm brave.
I'm brave.
I am willing.
I'm willing.
Start with your own past. Look at it. Claim a gift. And then make that commitment of who you intend to be moving forward. May it be so.
What better way to claim that I am willing than to sing, I am willing. So I hope you'll join us in singing our closing hymn. The chorus you'll hear right up here at the beginning, and just join us every time you hear it. The words will be up on your screen.
It to be hopeless would seem so strange. It is honest thus to go before us, so lift me out to the light of change. May our children see to be hopeless would seem so strange. It is honest thus to go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. Give me almighty
Because of the rain, we will not have a fire drill, so instead we will practice drinking coffee on the portico or going to your faith formation groups as you had planned. And now, as we go from this place, let us be fools for love and pilgrims for justice. And until we meet again, may we walk, rock, and roll in beloved community. Go in peace.